The sun hung heavy over the Houston Heights in the early 1970s, a blanket of humidity that pressed secrets into the pavement. This was a place of blue-collar pride, where the rhythmic hum of industry provided the soundtrack to everyday life and neighbors looked out for one another from their shaded porches. In this close-knit community, trust wasn't just a courtesy. It was the foundation of survival. It was within this world of simple expectations that a man named Dean Corll moved with practiced ease. To those who passed him on the street, he was the picture of suburban reliability, a polite, soft-spoken veteran who had served his country and now spent his days working for his family's business, the Corll Candy Company. He was a pillar of the community who always had a kind word for local children. Soon, the neighborhood children began to know him by a different name, the Candy Man. It was a title earned through simple, seemingly selfless acts of generosity. Dean would often pull his car over to hand out bags of sweets or invite the local boys to his family's factory for treats. To the young boys of the Heights, he was more than just a neighbor. He was a paternal figure, a source of snacks and smiles in a world that could often be harsh. But beneath that polished exterior of civic duty and sugary kindness, a predatory darkness was festering. Dean Corll was a master of the mask, hiding a hollow, cold interior behind the warm aroma of chocolate and peppermint. He wasn't just looking to provide snacks. He was scouting for his next victim, viewing the neighborhood not as a home, but as a private hunting ground where the most vulnerable could be picked off. The transition from local benefactor to something far more sinister began with the manipulation of young David Brooks. Corll didn't just want a companion. He wanted an asset. Using his financial influence and a calculated brand of mentorship, he began to groom the young man, offering him money and gifts that Brooks couldn't find elsewhere in his struggling life. Before long, Brooks found himself entangled in a web of dependency, his moral compass slowly eroded by Corll's quiet, persistent commands. Then came Elmer Wayne Henley, a charismatic but troubled teenager who was desperately searching for a father figure. Corll saw the spark of desperation in Henley and fanned it into a flame of loyalty. Through a methodical grooming process, Corll transformed these two teenagers into procurers. He used psychological manipulation and financial rewards to bind them to his will, turning their youthful energy into a tool for his own depraved desires. As the months turned into years, a chilling pattern began to emerge in the Heights. Boys were vanishing. One day a teenager would be seen playing ball or walking home from school, and the next, he would simply be gone, leaving behind nothing but an empty bedroom and a family paralyzed by grief. Despite the growing list of missing children, the atmosphere of dread was met with a wall of institutional indifference. The Houston Police Department dismissed the disappearances as simple runaways. They told the frantic mothers and fathers that their sons had likely just hopped a bus to find adventure elsewhere, ignoring the screams of intuition from the parents who knew their boys would never just leave. This tragic failure left the families in agony and gave Corll the ultimate shield, the silence of the authorities. The darkness reached a point of no return when the first betrayal occurred. A close friend of the accomplices was lured to Corll's home under the guise of a party, marking the moment when Henley and Brooks became fully complicit in the horror. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. the realization began to settle in that the sweets and the gentle smiles were merely a lure for a trap that was about to snap shut on the entire community, transforming the Candyman into a name that would haunt Texas history forever. And the quiet suburban streets of Houston provided the perfect camouflage for what lay behind the closed doors of Dean Corll's home in the Westmoreland district. Inside, his facade dissolved into a clinical reality. Corll didn't just kill, he sought total dominion. Central to his private world was the torture board, a custom-built plywood structure. This wasn't merely a tool of violence. It was a stage where Corll performed his darkest impulses, asserting an absolute power that defied comprehension and human morality. Muffled walls ensured the frantic pleas of the victims never reached the ears of the neighbors. For Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks, the horror was a constant, suffocating presence. Corll maintained control over them through a twisted alchemy of psychological manipulation. As their benefactor, he provided gifts and a sense of belonging they lacked elsewhere. But this generosity was a barbed hook. He shared the trauma of his crimes with them, making them silent partners in blood. By involving them in the disposal of young bodies, he ensured their silence through mutual guilt. They became a murderous family, bound together by a secret so heavy and dark, it crushed their remaining innocence. Corll played on their fears, alternating between a fatherly mentor and a cold-eyed executioner who viewed every boy as a trophy. The methodology of the crimes was devastatingly simple. Corll would encourage Henley and Brooks to invite their close friends over for parties. These gatherings were advertised as fun with music and soda. To the boys of the Heights, an invitation to a simple house with a color television was an irresistible draw, and they walked through the front door with smiles, expecting entertainment. But once the door clicked shut and the deadbolt turned, the atmosphere shifted. The music now drowned out the struggle. The Candyman would emerge from the shadows, no longer the polite neighbor, but a predator who had finally cornered his prey in a trap from which there was no return. As the years progressed, Corll's appetite for control and violence only grew. The frequency of the murders accelerated, and the logistics of his horrific crimes required a permanent solution for the evidence. This led to the rental of a unit at Southwest Boat Storage. To the outside world, it was just another storage space. In reality, it became a clandestine graveyard, a mass grave hidden in plain sight. Beneath the dirt floor of the shed, Corll and his accomplices buried the boys of Houston, layering them like forgotten memories. The number of victims began to mount in secret, yet the world outside remained tragically unaware of the hidden carnage. The psychological weight began to fracture Elmer Wayne Henley's resolve. He wasn't just bringing strangers to Corll, he was bringing his own close friends, one after another. Watching them disappear into the darkness of the playroom left a permanent scar. He was caught in a lethal cycle of self-loathing and surviving day to day. Meanwhile, Corll's confidence morphed into a dangerous sense of invincibility. He watched as the Houston Police Department continued to dismiss the missing boys as simple, bored runaways. This neglect fueled Corll's sense of invincibility, and there were near misses, moments when a neighbor heard a noise. But each time Corll's mask of normalcy and civic duty held firm. Over time, the act of killing became a routine part of their lives. The horror that once induced nausea became a logistical task. This desensitization was the final stage of Corll's victory. He had stripped them of their humanity. On a night of relentless rain, the air in Corll's house grew thick with a suffocating tension in the heavy, humid night air. Henley, looking at the cold, calculating eyes of his mentor, realized that the cycle of procurement had limits. He saw the way Corll looked at him, no longer as a trusted partner, but as a liability. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The next person the Candy Man decided to retire might just be young Elmer Wayne Henley himself. When the humid night of August 8th, 1973, felt like a pressure cooker about to explode within the walls of Dean Corll's Pasadena home, Elmer Wayne Henley had made a fatal error in judgment, or perhaps a subconscious attempt at rebellion, by bringing a young girl, Rhonda Williams, and another friend, Tim Curley, over to the house. To Corll, this was an unforgivable breach of the secrecy that had protected his atrocities for years. The polite neighbor vanished instantly, replaced by a man possessed by a cold rage. He realized that his protege was no longer under his absolute control. The mask of the Candy Man lay in pieces on the floor as he produced a pistol and handcuffs, his eyes devoid of the paternal warmth he had used to lure so many to their graves. Mike Corll forced Elmer Wayne Henley to help him bind the two terrified newcomers to the torture board and the floor. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and the whimpers of the captives. In that moment, Corll's depravity reached its zenith. He informed Henley that he was tired of his disobedience and intended to kill all three of them. He described the horrors he would inflict with a clinical detachment that chilled Henley to the bone. For the first time, the young man saw himself clearly, not as a partner in a dark game, but as a trophy waiting to be claimed by his mentor. It was a life-or-death choice that required Henley to choose between his own survival and his loyalty to a monster. Henley, drawing on the very manipulation Corll had taught him, began to plead for his life with intensity. He promised total submission, swearing he would help Corll with the work ahead if only his hands were freed to assist. In a rare, fatal lapse of tactical judgment fueled by his own arrogance, Corll believed him. As soon as the restraints fell away, Elmer Wayne Henley seized a .22 caliber pistol. The room erupted in the cracks of gunfire. Corll slumped to the floor, the monster finally brought down by the very weapon he had sharpened. The reign of the Candy Man ended not with grand justice, but with a frantic, bloody struggle in a cramped room. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gasps of the survivors. A trembling Henley dialed the police, his voice a wreck, as he confessed to the killing. When the authorities arrived, the scene they encountered was merely the prologue to a much larger nightmare. Henley, a shattered shell of a teenager, he began to speak the truth that had been buried for years. He led investigators to the Southwest Boat Storage, a place the community had passed 1,000 times. As the police began to dig into the floor of the rented shed, the true scale of Corll's predation was unearthed. One by one, 28 missing boys were found. The discovery sent shock waves through Houston. Families who had been told their sons were simply runaways were forced to face a reality far more gruesome than any disappearance. The grief was communal, a heavy shroud that settled over the neighborhood. In the ensuing trials, the public struggled to categorize Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks. Were they monsters who enjoyed the carnage, or were they the ultimate victims of Corll's psychological warfare? Both received multiple life sentences. It's their youth spent behind bars for the sins they facilitated. The legacy of Dean Corll changed the landscape of American law enforcement forever. The runaway myth was shattered, leading to sweeping reforms in how missing persons reports were handled, ensuring that the pleas of desperate parents would never again be ignored by the state. Yet for the people of Houston, the scars were deeper than any legal policy. The Heights lost more than just 28 sons. It lost the belief that evil is easily recognizable. The city learned that the most terrifying predators are the ones who live next door, the ones who offer a helping hand and a piece of candy with a smile that hides a hollow, hungry soul.